So for this next project, what we're going to be working on is we're going to be making objects out of slabs. Our last assignment was kind of a combination of slab with a coil, or many of you guys may have just done slab altogether, but this one's just going to be all slab. And we're going to be making maybe a slightly larger slab. What we're going to be doing is we're going to be making cups with handles. So that way we have an extra element that we're adding to this thing. I know the last one with the shallow tray, the one that I demonstrated was one with handles. It was an option for you guys to do that. For this one, there is not going to be an option for handles. You guys are going to put handles on these things. A couple of things that I want to talk about is at this point in time, you may have some clay pieces and parts that you've used that are smaller bits of clay. And what we don't want to do with little small bits of clay, I've got a chunk of clay here. And what I'm going to do is just kind of cut a few pieces off of it. So let's say that you had, some extra bits laying around. Like so, right? If they're unusable, small little pieces, and we want to get a larger piece, we can put these pieces back together. But what we can't do is just immediately start using them. If I take a piece of clay and just go like this and be like, oh, let me take this and smash it into a ball, what I sometimes will end up doing is I'll start trapping air. Okay, remember we talked about this much earlier. We don't want to have trapped air in any of our pieces because when they go into the kiln and they get fired, what can happen is those pieces can explode in the kiln. And that explosion is not like a violent explosion or anything like that. It just will destroy your piece. And on occasion, if it's close enough to another student's piece of work that's kind of fragile, sometimes what can happen is that their piece can actually break a little bit as well. So we want to keep that from happening. So if we have smaller pieces of clay and larger pieces of clay, we can actually put those pieces together and do something called wedging. Wedging is where we're going to be removing the air from the clay, all right? And when we make bigger slabs, this is actually something that's kind of important as well, because even that clay as it comes from the manufacturer, from the clay supplier, when we get it, it potentially could have some air in it. And a lot of the things we've done so far, pounding it really hard, pinching, things like that can kind of compress everything and work some of those air bubbles out if they exist. But especially when we take pieces of clay and put them together like this, that's when we're really going to get some, potentially get some air bubbles in our clay, which is not a good thing, all right? So when I do wedging, I don't want to wedge a little small piece of clay like this because it's hard to get your hands around it. So I typically will wedge a larger piece of clay. And we're going to use a larger piece of clay for this project anyways to make some larger slabs. All right. So if I take this and just kind of put it together, one thing I can do is I can use this and just kind of pound it down on the surface to start to kind of turn it into a ball shape, because before it was kind of a rectangular shape, things were a little bit odd. So I'm just doing this, okay? Just to kind of get rid of any sharp edges, all right? So there we go. This certainly is going to cause an air bubble if I were to take this and just start pounding it out like this, right? It's going to start to fold over here and start to trap some air. So that's where wedging is going to come into play. And when you wedge, you need to be standing up to do a wedging. You can't kind of do it like this on the table. You need to be able to get some weight down onto the clay. So I'm going to go ahead and stand myself up, and I'm going to position this camera so that it's looking just directly at the table surface. We'll still see a couple of different angles here. And when we go to wedge, right, need to see where oh yeah, there we go. What I'm going to do is I'm going to lift that clay up like this, put my hands over top of it, and push down. You can see that majority of my pressure is right here on this part of my hand, right? That meaty part of the thumb, okay, and the palm of your hand. That's where you want to apply the pressure, okay? And as we wedge, this is what we do, right? We just continually lift it up so that it goes onto this little tip, okay? Right? And we push the clay down like so. And we do it over and over again. And I'm keeping my hands inward this direction, right? Very important that I keep those hands in that way. That helps keep the clay from just stretching out long ways this direction, okay? So, and it's like a little ramp. I'm just kind of going over. My clay looks like it's a little bit dry. And so if you're getting a lot of cracking like this, which is what I'm getting here, okay? If you're getting that kind of cracking, then your clay's probably a little bit on the drier side. And one thing that you can do is you can take your sponge, your small sponge, that round sponge that came in your kit, and you can take that and you can kind of soak it in water and then put it into your bag of clay and leave it kind of overnight and then come back to it. And it kind of creates a little bit of a rainforest inside. And when that happens, when you get all that moisture in there, the clay is going to absorb some of that moisture, okay? But one thing we can see here is we can see how it's kind of spiraling right there. This technique, it's called spiral wedging, okay? It's also called skull wedging, because as you're doing this, I tend to get real rhythmic when I do it. It actually will start to take on the shape of kind of like a cow skull, and it's kind of hard to see, but you can maybe see it here, right? Where you have here where the horns would be connected, and then this is this kind of front part of the mouth of the skull, all right? So that's kind of why they call it skull wedging, all right? And then once we do this and get it to where we feel like we're done wedging, we kind of just can roll it over onto itself, and we can do the same thing here. Kind of shift it around like this to start to get rid of some of those marks that were there. Same thing on this one. And now it's closer to a ball of clay. And so what I'm going to now do is just kind of pound it out with my hands. Being careful not to fold anything over that might trap air. And if I have any spots that have any of these little like marks, I can just kind of use my thumb, add a little bit of moisture if I need to kind of get rid of any of those marks, because we want to get rid of them. And then we'll have a nice ball of clay to work with, all right? So that's kind of the wedging idea. That's how you want to get it going. If that clay is dry, then you want to make sure that you re-wet it, because it's very difficult to wedge dry clay, all right? And so I've got another piece of clay here that's ready to go. It's a pretty decent sized ball of clay, all right? Bigger than a softball. It's wet enough for me to go to this next process to start turning it into a slab. And this is going to be just like the last time that we made a slab. We're going to start out by kind of holding it higher up and dropping it down to our table surface. And I can even use my hand to kind of smash it down like so. And I can use my fist just like we did before to start turning this into a slab. Take my bracelet off because I think it's going to start making some marks in my clay, which I don't want to have happen. But I want to pick this up every now and then because it's going to leave this kind of wet spot on your board that you're working on. You can also do this, I think I talked about it in the last video, you can do this out on concrete outside as long as it's clean and kind of a little bit on the slicker side. If you have a garage, a lot of times the cement in the garage is a little bit more polished, and that works out really nicely. Now, the other thing I want to show you guys is once we get this thing going, which we did it before, we did this kind of floppy stuff like this to start to get it moving, is that if you guys have at your disposal, or if you want to go and get a dowel from like Home Depot or Ace Hardware or Michael's, you can get a dowel and you can kind of cut it so it's a little bit shorter, and then you can use this as like a rolling pin. You can also use a rolling pin from the kitchen, but remember that you want to clean this thing, okay? Also ask some permission if it's not your rolling pin, but we can use this and we can actually roll clay out using the flatness of my hand, right? And this is going to get a little bit more uniform of a flatness to my piece of clay, all right? You can see that I can apply pressure, and I'm sitting down right now, but if I stood up and started doing this, then it would actually get, I would be able to push a little bit more on it, get a little bit more weight in there, and adding that extra weight down on the clay is going to help stretch it out a little bit quicker, okay? So rolling something out like this is something that will work out really well for you as well. And then depending on what kind of object you want to make, sometimes we want to make these longer pieces of clay, right? And when we do that and make that and turn it into a longer piece of clay, we can have a longer piece of clay to wrap around and make a cup shape. Or we might want to keep turning this and turn it a quarter of a turn like this, and then roll it out a little bit more in this direction so that we can keep it as like a circle, right? All depends on how big of a piece of clay you have and what kind of a situation you want to have going there, all right? So those are things to think about. I'm going to go ahead and just finish putting together this slab of clay so that it gets down to the thickness that we're looking for. Same thing like we talked about before. We're looking for about 3/8 of an inch to a 1/4 of an inch. So 1/4 of an inch is a little bit smaller. 3/8 of an inch is a little bit wider. For smaller cups, you probably want to go to a 1/4 of an inch, right? Right now, my slab of clay is a little bit more than, it's almost a 1/2 an inch right now, okay? And I want to get it down, okay? So I'm going to continue. And remember, I don't have to roll with the rolling pin. I can use my fist and pound it out. I can use that technique that we talked about where we lift it up and we kind of stretch it out, which is kind of hard for me to show you guys how to do with the camera setup, but it looks like it's working okay. And that'll get it going quickly. I'm also getting some cracking on this, which means that I've got a little bit drier clay altogether. Probably need to re-wet this stuff, but I think it'll work out for this project at least. All right, I'm gonna stand up and kind of get my body weight into it. You don't want it to spend too much time on the table. You want to still remember to lift it up and move it because it'll stick, all right? And we're trying to get it as even as possible. It doesn't have to be perfect. I'm going to take a look at it and see how much we've got. I've got it at about 3/8 of an inch right now. I'm going to try and go a little bit thinner with it because I want to make a little bit thinner of an object. All right. So I'm going to pick it up one more time and kind of move it. And I'm trying to make this thing a little bit on the longer side so that I can come back to it and have a nice long piece to make a cup. All right. So for this project, we're going to be making more than 1 cup. We're going to be making 3 cups. And those 3 cups don't have to relate to one another. They could be any 3 style of cups that you would like to make. If you haven't already done so, there's going to be a portion of this module that will be about images of cups. That'll be in a discussion form, so if you haven't already taken a look at that, you need to go and do that before you begin, so that way you have some imagery to go off of, to understand shapes of cups and what we might be interested in making. That's always an important thing, is kind of having a plan, right? We don't want to come at this and just try and fly by the seat of our pants. We want to have a plan. We want to know what it is that we're going to be making, right? That makes it a little bit easier for our brains to wrap around everything and understand what we want to do, or what we're going to be able to do. So again, I'm going to pull that up, and I'm going to flip it over to the other side. I'm going to set it down, right? And that looks pretty good. I'm going to roll this side just real gently. That'll get rid of some of the marks that you see. I'm not really pushing very hard on this. I don't want to push very hard on it because I don't want to get it to stick to the table that much or stick to my board that much. And that was successful because now I peel it up and I can feel that it wasn't quite as stuck as it was before. So some of these edges that are around here, okay, these edges are not going to necessarily be used, right? But it's okay if you end up using them, right? Maybe this kind of a mark is something that you want for somewhere on your object. Probably don't want to use this for the rim of your cup. That would be kind of, you know, a little difficult to do. So we want to make sure that we use whatever part is that we want to use, right? We can also come to this and we can use our fingers to kind of, you know, get rid of any imperfections that might be there. A little bit of moisture to drag my finger across. And now we've got a slab that we can work with, okay? So I'm going to start out with a pretty basic style cup. I've got a ruler here. You guys have seen me use this one before. Any kind of a straight edge will work. It doesn't even have to be a ruler. It can be the side of a box. It can be the side of a book. It can be the side of anything that's straight, right? Even an envelope or something like that. Certainly things that we can use when we're making these objects, right? So I'm going to come to this, and I'm going to use my Fettling knife, because I like the Fettling knife because it's got this rounded edge on it. Some of you guys may have gotten one of these already. If you haven't, you can go on to Amazon. You can find them there. Or you can look at one of the local clay suppliers. We've got Laguna Clay and Supply and Aardvark Clay and Supply. Both of them will ship. So you can use one of those if you haven't already gotten something like this. But having a little bit of a straight edge here is a good idea, okay? So what I'm going to do is I'm going to find kind of my longer area here, and I'm going to try and make a pretty straight cut, right? Or at least a straight line, okay? And then hold that there. And my tool is very straight up and down when I do this, okay, for these edges. That's important to remember, okay? And then I can remove that part that I just cut, and now I've got a nice straight spot for me to work off of, right? Having a straight spot for me to work off of is a great thing, okay? So I'm going to come here, and I'm going to think about how tall I want my cup to be. I'm thinking somewhere probably around 4.5 inches. I might do 4.5 so that way when this thing shrinks in the kiln, then I've got a little bit to work with. I've just marked it in 2 spots so it can have a nice straight spot here. I'm going to set that down, and I'm going to do the same thing here. cut that clay. I've got that tool straight up and down, not on an angle. My straight edge stuck here, so I'll just peel that up. There we go. And now I want to cut this, and I'm not cutting it in any specific way right now. I'm just trying to get this portion off. I don't know how wide of an object I'm going to, or how, you know, what the circumference of my cup is going to be quite yet. So I'm just going to cut this off in the longest portion here that I can use. That way, if I need to cut it down, I can. And if I don't need to cut it down, then it's all ready to go. Okay? So set that aside a little bit. Very carefully, you see how I'm using just the tips of my fingers, lots of surface area touching, because I'm having to peel this up a little bit. It does tend to stick to the surface that we're using, so you just have to be a little bit careful. All right, and then I'll set that aside as well. And now I'm going to come to my extra pieces, my extra slabs of clay that I have here. Cut them off and make them a bit more manageable for me to deal with. And then I'm going to think about how big of an object I want to make. Now, the shape of my cup doesn't matter. It could be round, it could be squared, it could be an oval, right? You just need to think about it in terms of how you're going to use this cup and whether or not it's going to be usable. Square cups are a little bit more difficult to drink out of, but they do work. You typically will be drinking out of a corner of a squared cup. Or maybe you want to make it more squared on the sides, and then the top part where it comes together, that could be round, all right? It's all up to you as the maker as to what it is that you want to do, all right? If you're going to make something that's circular, then you can use an object to make that circle a little bit easier to make. So, you know, you can kind of use it as a template. We've talked about using templates in the past. So that's something that could work out to your advantage. And that's something that I'm going to do, is I'm going to use a little bit of a template for me to be able to do that. Again, just things from around the house, right? So I've got here a lid to a peanut butter jar. And so I can take that and I can set it down here. And I mean, I can do one of two things. I can actually take this and just kind of tap it down, move it around this edge like this. I'm not going to use it like a cookie cutter. Right now I'm just kind of pushing down on the edge so then I can release it and see, right? There's a couple spots there that didn't translate. So I've got to maybe push a little bit harder on a few other of the edges so I can see where that is. There's my circle, okay? And now I can use my tool to come in and cut that circle out. Again, look at how my knife tool is positioned. It's straight up and down. You have to think about these things as you are working. How can I get my best cut? And right now I'm kind of moving it around in a big circle like this, which is a little bit more difficult to do, a little bit easier if we just maneuver that piece around and actually have, you know, like just be cutting towards us. It's a little bit easier just to cut towards yourself. This kind of stuff, save it, right? You never know when you might need something to add to your object. We are going to have to be making handles here in a second. So maybe using some of this to make the handle is what we're going to do, okay? So there's the base for my cup, and I have to decide, am I going to put the base, my slab around it this way, or am I going to set that slab right on top of this? Well, it might be better if I set the slab directly on top, and that's because that's going to help, like gravity is going to help us kind of push that down, and when I go to connect these, scoring and slipping, it might be a little bit easier for me to do that, okay? So then what I'm going to do with this slab is I'm going to get it positioned so that you guys can see everything that's going on. There we go. And I'm going to take this portion and I'm going to hold it upright. and I'm going to set this directly onto my round base. And I'm going to take a look and see where this all kind of lines up, make sure that it's lining up nicely. And then I've got to kind of figure out where these two are going to go together, right? Okay, so now I can take a look here and I can come pretty close. I'm gonna go a little bit on the wider side of things. I'm gonna have, and you don't have to do it this way. I'm gonna show you another way to do this in just a moment. If I want to, I can have these two pieces kind of overlap here, and I can squish them together to get them to stick. And this may be a little bit easier for you when you're first learning how to do a slab. So I'm going to show you guys this at the beginning. So I'm going to make this a little bit wider, not too much wider. That's maybe about a ½ inch wider, or longer, I should say. And then I'm going to use my tool, and I'm going to cut directly down, trying to stay as straight as I can, like so, all right? And so there's going to be a bit of an overlap that's going to happen here, and that's okay, right? This is going to kind of help me a little bit to get these two objects together. I'm going to show you just in a moment another way to do this to where we don't get this overlap, and maybe you'll try this on one of your pieces and try the overlap on or try the other technique on another one. So what I'm going to do now is I'm going to connect these two pieces together. And the way that I'm going to connect those two pieces together is the same way that we've done everything so far, and that's going to be scratching and slipping. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to kind of mark and see where these two pieces are going to go together, right? So I'm going to use my needle tool and just very gently drag it up to the surface like that. So I can see. I'm also going to go on the inside and I'm going to do that same kind of a drag so I can see what's going on. All right. Then I'm going to remove this from my base, which the clay will stick a little bit because of gravity. Gravity's been kind of pushing down on it. So I'm going to remove that so I can kind of have it to the side and I don't have to worry about the base right now. What I don't want to do is take this slab and flatten it all the way out. If I flatten this slab all the way out, then it's going to take all those clay particles and spread them out. And then when I go to put them back together, it's going to move the clay particles again. And when that happens, you get a little bit more warping and you can end up having a few more problems with your objects. So you don't want that. So instead, we're going to keep this pretty still in that rounded position, right? Like that. Just open it up a little bit, okay? And then we're going to go and we're going to see where that mark is. And I'm going to scratch. So, as you can see, I've got a good scratch right here. I've also gotten a good scratching or scoring on the inside, right? Both spots. And then, just like we've done in the past, we're going to add some slip or some moisture in some way, shape, or form. I've got some older slip here that I've just got to mix up because I added a little bit of water to it earlier. I just want to get it all back into kind of a usable, nice liquid. And remember, you don't have to use slip. You can use saliva, you can use water. Water's not quite as good. Water doesn't help keep these things together all that much. Using slip or using saliva or using a 10% of vinegar to water, 10% vinegar, 90% water, that's going to be a little bit more helpful in getting this together. It's just that the pH of our saliva and the pH of vinegar it's a better pH for, it's slightly more acidic, and it helps keep everything together quite a bit better. Minimizes cracking in the firing process. So that's why we want to do that kind of stuff. All right. So I've got now some decent slip. I can use this slip. I've got a little brush that I use. We're going to apply the slip on both sides. If it was anything else, we're going to always do everything on both sides. We don't just do it on one. All right. So we're going to apply that slip on both sides. Get a good amount of it on there, because remember, we want this stuff to squish when we go to connect it. A little bit harder for me to do while it's facing that camera. So I'm just going to turn it around here. But all I'm doing is rescoring in a couple of different directions, just like we've done with all of our other work that we've done so far. Scratching and slipping, very important part of our process as ceramic artists. It's the way to connect clay to clay. It's not the only way, but it's the best way. So now I'm going to take these two and I'm going to get them together, and I'm going to push. I'm just applying a little bit of pressure right now. All right. A little bit at a time. And now I'm squishing a little bit harder. And I can only reach down a little bit. I can't reach down all the way to the bottom, but that's okay. I can come back to it and turn it around like so, keeping it upright without having to hold it in my hand and cradle it. And I can be applying that pressure on that second part that I couldn't quite reach. And this is going to make a pretty tall cup, but that's okay. You can make really tall cups. You can make shorter cups. It's all dependent on what it is that you want to make. You are the maker. Let that creativity shine. Now, one thing that this technique will do, where I'm just squishing these together by overlapping, is that this is going to leave a mark on the outside, right? It's going to leave a mark like so. And that's okay. There's nothing wrong with having a mark on your piece of clay. Sometimes people like to show those marks as a sign of how this object was built, all right? And then sometimes people don't like that mark. So they will go through and they will do what they can to make that mark disappear, which is something that you can do as well. It's all up to you as the maker. I'm just drawing my finger up that edge so I can kind of smooth it out a little bit. All right. Keeping that back into the round. Kind of can flatten that out a little bit as well. Move it over to the other side. Also take a look at the inside, right? This is where craftsmanship comes into play. We don't want to just leave that inside portion untreated. So I probably want to get in here and kind of draw my finger across there as well. and kind of smooth that out a little bit. It doesn't have to be completely gone. You can still leave some remnants of that connection, of that seam, if you will. That's okay. I can even see it right here on the top, and that's okay. There's nothing wrong with having that there, but you want to treat it, right? Make it look like it was on purpose. Don't make it look like an accident. If you want to show the seam, show the seam. But if you're trying to hide the seam, completely hide the seam. If you just kind of try and hide the seam and then you can see it and it doesn't look like it was done on purpose, then people tend to think that you made a mistake. And we don't want people to think that we're making mistakes. We want to do things deliberately. So I am going to connect these two together, having that seam still in place, but making my viewer understand that I wanted that seam there. I wanted it to look like it was put together that way. So how can I do that in a good way, right? Just being very careful, all right? So now I've got that portion of it, and now I've got my base, and we're just gonna score and slip and put these two together, okay? Same thing, mark the inside. See where that is. I'm gonna come here from the top, just a gentle touch with my needle tool, because remember, we've only got 1/4 of an inch here. If I push down too hard with my needle tool, then I'm cutting in to the clay, and I don't want that to happen. And I'm going to have to pull that off, right? And that just gives us kind of a guideline as to where we want to score. And now we score and slip. So now I've turned it over because I want to apply some pressure, but I want to be very precise with how I'm doing that rather than just pushing down on the whole thing. So now I've got it turned upside down and I'm going around this edge. And this is a spot for, what I'm creating. I'm going to kind of get rid of the seam that's here. And so that's kind of why I'm being a little bit more precise. That seam can live. You can have that seam living there and you can have it be a part of your piece. But if I left it just like this, you can see it's not very aesthetically pleasing. There's all these little kind of clay crumbs that are hanging all over the place. And I still need to get it a little bit more connected. So I'm going to kind of support the wall. And notice that I've actually been supporting these walls throughout the making process. That's very important to do, is to support. You saw me when I was scratching that I was actually holding on to my slab of clay so that way it didn't stretch out, right? That's important, okay? So there we go. I've got it. I think I've got it on there well, okay? Good enough. And maybe I give it just a little bit of a tap down below just to kind of make sure that it's sticking. One spot that I want to kind of maybe have a little bit of this seam disappear on is just right here on the lip, okay? And I've got a little bit of sharpness to the lip as well, and this is where pinching comes into play. I can come around here on the edge and kind of just give a little bit of a pinch here, and I can start to kind of smooth out or round out those edges. You don't want, for especially a cup where somebody's going to be placing their lips, you don't want to have a really sharp edge there. It doesn't feel nice on the lips. The fluid doesn't come out of the cup quite as nicely. And I can kind of thin out this edge a little bit to make it a nicer, cleaner edge. And that's what I'm doing. And I'm going to get most of it done here when it's in the wet stage. And then I'm going to let it dry a little bit and get into that cheese hard stage. And then I can come back to it and kind of further manipulate that rim if I need to make it the softness that I want and the shape that I want. Sometimes it's best when we touch things and manipulate them in the wet stage, and sometimes that's a little bit better done when it's in the cheese hard stage, right? So just something to think about as you're making these objects, okay? And then we're going to go through and we're going to kind of clean up this edge, okay? So what I can do to clean up that edge, I'm just holding this and cradling it nicely, right? I can come here with my finger. Sometimes adding a little bit of moisture helps, right? To kind of clean up that edge and get rid of it, okay? If you have a lot of wet kind of ooze or slop coming out of there from your slip, then it might be a good idea for you to wait a little bit of time before you come and start doing this. My slip is a little bit on the drier side of things. It's not a super wet slip. I could have added a little bit more moisture to it, but I didn't. And doing something like that, or if it's a bit of a wetter slip, that's where you maybe will run into some problems. So just kind of let that dry a little bit. Just very gentle in the way that I'm coming here, and we can see that I'm making that go away, that seam go away. Now what I want to do is take a look at the inside and see whether or not I can see any of my tooling marks down in there from scratching and slipping. And this is again where craftsmanship comes into play. And we'll want to get in there and make any manipulations that we need to, right? And if we can't fit our hand inside of there, we can get a tool inside of there to help us out. So I'm going to use this little kind of end of my needle tool. You guys also have that wooden knife tool, and unfortunately I don't have one of those here. Need to get one. I have a ton of them in the studio, just none here at the house. So we've got to improvise, right? Use something different. But just treating everything, that's where craftsmanship comes into play. If you get any little bits of clay on there, you can just do that, put it right into your slip cup. That clay can be used later, add a little bit more moisture, let it sit for a couple of hours, and then mix it all up, okay? All right, so there we go. Now we've got just basically a cylinder that we've created, and it doesn't have to be a cylinder, okay? There's so many different ways that we can do things. I'm gonna set this aside for now. We're gonna do the handle as a separate demonstration, but this is what we're gonna start out with. But real quick, I'm gonna show you one other way that we can connect things. So I'm gonna set that one aside. I'm gonna get one other piece of clay here. This is gonna be a very shallow cup, but I want you guys to kind of see. You don't have to make everything straight up and down, like a straight up and down cylinder like I did. They can be a little bit more, I'm gonna thin this out just a little bit. So I feel like we can get it a bit thinner, especially since it's gonna be maybe a smaller cup. So I'm gonna take this and roll it out a little bit on the thinner side. I can also do my kind of slapping on the table surface, stretching it out, and then I'll come back to it afterwards. This is one thing that I like about using something like a rolling pin is we get it pretty flat with pounding it out and doing the stretching of the clay, but we can get it a bit more precise if we go through with that rolling pin, okay? So if I wanted to say make an object that was a little bit more on the kind of flared out side of things, then I don't want to have a perfectly flat edge. I want to actually have a little bit of a curve. All right, just a very gentle curve, like so. Straight up and down on that cut. This is the one good thing I like about the Fettling knife versus, I do like to use X-Acto blades a lot, but an X-Acto blade on a piece of wood like this, if I'm pushing, I'm actually cutting the board, and I don't want to cut the board necessarily. So, because of the size that I'm working with right here, this is going to be a very short cup, a very small cup. So what I'm going to do is try and kind of give myself some marks here so I can follow that same kind of thickness or height, if you will. Let's see, we'll probably be able to go to about 3 inches, which actually isn't going to be too bad. Give myself a bunch of marks here to go off of. And you can be a little bit more, you know, you don't have to be precise like me and measure everything. I'm kind of a measuring kind of guy. I think that comes down to some of my woodworking background. But you don't have to do it that way, right? You can kind of just be a little bit more free form if you want to. And this doesn't have to be perfect. I'm just going to kind of follow those lines that I just created to try and get it about the same curve. And obviously we're going to make a base for this, but I'm not going to make a base at this moment. I'm just going to go off of what we got here. Now, a different way to connect these things is to do what's called a bevel cut. And a bevel cut is where I'm going to come through here, make sure that I'm kind of 90 degrees here, and I'm going to cut it on a 45-degree angle, like so, okay? So not straight up and down with the knife tool, more of an angle, all right? Like that. You guys can see how that's cut at a 45-degree angle, okay? So if we take another piece of clay, which you'll see in a second, not another piece of clay, but the same clay, when we cut this and we put this together, if I've got this beveled edge, and if I have another beveled edge that's next to it, like so, cut this at like a 45. All right, I've got these two pieces of clay that are both at a 45. If I put them together like so, they're going to go together like this, and I can create a seamless look, right, without having that seam like you saw earlier. Again, scratching and slipping, okay? These are two different thicknesses of clay, but that's okay, right? That beveled edge gives us more surface area to be able to connect these two together. It's much better than doing what's called, that's called a bevel joint, than what's called a butt joint. And that's where you take the end of this, which is a 90-degree angle, and a 90-degree angle here, and put them together. That would be a butt joint. You can do that, and you can score and slip here, and you can score and slip here, but it's not as good of a connection because you don't have as much surface area. When you do that beveled cut, you get a lot more surface area. So if I get this together and I try and figure out where that's going to go together, right? I did it at a very kind of low angle, essentially, right, where that curve was. And so because of that, it's just going to be flared a little bit. It's not going to be flared a lot. If you want it to flare more, you've got to make a more aggressive curve, okay? So I just want to see where those are going to go together. I want to make sure that I do the opposite cut on that, right? So I'm just going to come here and go straight down, 45-degree angle cut again. And then when these two go together, right, they'll be going together like so and creating that beveled cut. Again, we're going to be scoring and slipping those together, okay, to make it what we want, right? And so if I want it to be a little bit more aggressive, which I'm looking at it and it's a little bit on the softer side of things, so I'm going to try and see if I can get it a little bit more aggressive like so. And if we score and slip those together, we can get them to go together, and then I have a little bit of a beveled cup. All right, so just something to think about. You can also kind of stretch it out a little bit as you go. Oh, sorry, got rid of my 45. Supporting the wall as I'm cutting it. Okay, and then we can score and slip those together and make ourselves a cup. All right, so that's how we can make another style of cup, a little bit shallower, and it will end up having a little bit more of a bevel to it. Okay, so it's more like a V shape. All right, we'll get to handles a little bit later.